2 years ago, Americans watched in horror as a crisis unfolded at the Kabul airport.
There's desperation and anguish.
More than 80,000 Afghans have since arrived in America, but this story is still unfolding. I'm Andrea Smartin. In my new podcast, Stranger Becomes Neighbor, we'll find out what happens to these new arrivals in our communities. Who would help our newest neighbors? Follow us at kslpodcast.com, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen.
In today's episode of Project Recovery,
my real story starts with I started going into treatment at 15 years old. Addiction has been very heavy in my life for a long time.
Make sure you listen to the end. Find us on Facebook at Project Recovery. We'll have that and much more coming up. Hey, welcome to Project Recovery, a podcast about addiction, but more importantly, it's about recovery. And it's brought to you by our good friends at useonlyasdirected.org. They've got a new campaign. It's Know Your Script. And when they say Know Your Script, Dr. Matt, what do they talk about?
Well, I think it's a double meaning, right? They say know your script, like your prescription. What are you taking? Educate yourself on that. And then the other one is, what's your script conversation-wise? Are you asking the right questions when you go in? Are you afraid to talk to the doctor? Can you ask questions about alternatives? So know your script. You're in charge. Be a good consumer of your own healthcare.
Not only that, I think it's know your script when talking to your kids, talking to loved ones. Know the conversation that you're going to have, because when it comes to opioids, there are so many different conversations that could be had. And a lot of them don't, just because people are afraid to offend. People are afraid to not look like they know what they're doing. So they kind of just go off what the doctors are saying because they're the ones we trust. But if we're not honest with the doctors, they're not looking out for our best interest because they don't know what's going on with us. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Docs want to, most doctors just want to take good care of their patients. So they do their best. But if you have questions, you should learn how to talk to them about it and find out, are there alternatives to managing my pain post-surgery or things like that?
All right. Now, this is our first podcast via Zoom, if you will, because everybody's taking kind of a 14-day break to see if we can kind of get this pandemic somewhat under control. So doing our part, we're all doing a broadcast from our homes. And so, Matt, you're in your palatial state up in Bountiful. I'm in my humble abode right here in Farmington. We're going to talk to our guests in just a Yeah, we're going to talk to our guest in just a second. But normally during the podcast, this is where me and you kind of talk back and I kind of check in what's going on with my life, and then I get some free therapy from you. Does that sound about right?
That's about right, yeah.
So here's what's going on. So last week I was DJing a wedding, and it's kind of cool because I get front row seat to a lot of great events and a lot of magical moments. And so I was listening to this bride and groom as they're getting married, and the guy who was doing the ceremony, he said something that kind of, it took me down a place and then brought me back comfort. And when I say that, it was like, he was, most parents, and when you have your kids, there's a certain amount of pride when they go, oh, you're Casey's kid. Or your Jeannie's kid or something, because there's that pride that's built in that, hey, this is a product of me. This is something that I've created that is doing wonderful things, and it looks back upon you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. It's your legacy.
And so for the longest time, my legacy was awesome. It was really good. It was so much fun for my family and friends to go out and say, yeah, I'm best friends with Casey, or Casey Scott's my dad, or my son's Casey Scott. I remember this instant once because my dad kind of did the same work that I did. And wherever I went as a little kid, I'd always hear, oh, your dad's Mike Scott? And I always just thought it was cool. Yeah. And it gave me such joy to know that was my dad, because he's out there doing all these cool things. And then come 20 years later, I'm doing the same thing and having the same reaction with my loved ones and my friends. But after the DUI and after losing jobs, that wasn't a fun conversation to have. A lot of people were saying to my brothers, oh, you're Casey's brother. And so it was one of those things. And when that DUI happened and I did that, and I remember staring at the sky and I was thinking to myself, this is not how my story ends. This is I can't do this. And right now, and without being braggadocious or boastful or anything like that, I've heard from a couple people that my name's back associated with goodness and fighting, and that feels really, really good. And so that was kind of it's a long way to get there, but I remember there was a time that it wasn't cool to be associated with me. And
yeah, but that was a short time, right? And I think one of the things that has been great when people talk to me about you is how significantly you've rebounded from your addiction and from the DUI, and getting back out doing what you are born to do, and bringing, maybe, you're a more serious guy now, I would say, not in a bad way, in maybe a more mature way. And I think people relate to that. They want more of that sort of almost leadership from you. And so I think, yeah, you were down for a little bit, but most people are focused on this bounce back that you've had, and it's been great.
And I think that's cool, but I think what I wanted to do is tie that into recovery, because a lot of times we find ourselves doing things that we normally wouldn't do. And we wonder if that's how we're going to be seen for the rest of our lives. But if you go back and Google Robert Downey Jr., and I'm just using him as an example, is because that guy wouldn't be hired with a 10-foot pole, anything, for the longest time.
Right.
And he didn't give up. And now he's doing wonderful things. And I think what I want to tell people out there is that although you have messed up, it's never too late to turn your life around. You've got, we've heard it so many times on the podcast when people say the easiest way to get out of a ditch is to stop digging.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we need to stop digging and kind of reevaluate, Control Alt Delete, and figure out really what's important in life, and then start moving that way.
Well, that's that optimism. Optimism helps us realize that it really never is too late to do anything. To make improvements, to set goals and achieve them. People who are doing that throughout their life look back on their life and feel like they made the most of it. We all get discouraged sometimes, and certainly we all hit, roadblocks sometimes, but the reality is it's never too late to make, what you want your life to be, make it what you want it to be.
And I'll tell you what, if 2020 has done nothing, it's tested us around every corner.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
Are you tying this back to the wedding? Like, what did that have to do with anything?
Well, okay. He said that because the guy who was marrying the kid was the kid's dad. And he said every time he heard somebody talk about him, there was this pride built in. Well, okay.
You left that part of the story out the whole time. I'm waiting for this to roll back to the wedding, But okay, all right, I get it now. Thanks.
Yeah, but that's these guys are getting married, and that's what I'm thinking about. I was like,
okay,
yeah, all right. Well, maybe that wasn't the best story, but we're just trying this out. We often just talk about what's on top of our head.
It was a good story. Maybe I was slow. Maybe everyone else picked that up. I don't know. I was just waiting for the punchline.
All right. Now, can I ask you a serious question before we get to our guest today?
Sure.
Has anybody told you that you should put your computer above your head instead of looking down at it?
No. This isn't working for you?
No, well, I'm just going to say, it seems like we're wrestling and you're doing that thing where you're on top of me poking me in the chest. Like,
hang on. How's that? Wait, what's that? How's
that? Now go back to Matt. Now tip the top of your computer down a little bit.
I did. Is that good?
Okay. That's probably a little bit better. Just
got my Obey t-shirt on. Yeah.
It seemed like you were big timing me. Like you were you were menacing me. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, we just saw our guest, and our guest today is Rachael Pioltini. I think I said that right. Did I, Rachael?
You got it good.
All right. Now, Rachael, we've had you in the podcast, and that was probably about a year and a half ago, but you were just visiting with Brandon, who was on our podcast. And when I found out we had to do a Zoom one, I called you up. I said, what are you doing? You said, I'm working from home. I said, would you like to do a podcast? And you said, sign me up. And so here we are. How are you?
I'm good. I feel like the typical answer to that question today with everyone is I'm as good as we get. for what we have in this crazy world today. Like, it's unsure. We had crazy elections. Those are finally over. Now we've got crazy COVID in Utah. So, I mean, we're as good as we could get. My home so far is COVID free.
Yeah. Well, we're going to find out a little bit more about what you're doing now a little bit later. But to get there, we have to find out where you've been. And so the story of Rachael begins where?
So I'm a girl, my story starts, I'm from Queens, New York. Most of my family's from New York. We have a long history of addiction in my family. Addiction for me doesn't discriminate in any way. So my dad, gratefully, he was a heroin addict, and I'm 40. I'll put it out there. I'm 40, turning 41. But the reason I say that is because my dad this year celebrated 31 years in recovery. And so the beginning part of my story was your kind of typical, my dad was a heroin addict, so that's kind of how my childhood grew up. I grew up in a super dysfunctional Irish Catholic New York family. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of drugging, from back there. And my dad met my mom. Kind of cool story is my dad went to Odyssey House in New York because that's where it started. And we know Odyssey House here because it's a big program. Mm-hmm. He came here to get into recovery, and that's where he met my mom, which was kind of cool. So so that's kind of where my story started. I grew up, my mom was really depressed her whole life, so I grew up knowing a mom who was always in her room. So addiction has been big. We moved to Utah when I was in 5th grade. My parents wanted, my oldest sister, had started using. She's super hippie, but into the drug scene. So they thought coming to Utah and running from the problem was going to save everything. And it didn't, obviously. But not obviously, she ended up getting heavily involved into drugs. And she today is 6 months sober, which is really awesome.
Way to go.
Yeah, she had a little bit of time. She was a substance abuse counselor in Utah. She had like 8 years clean, and she did a heavy relapse and was out for like 2.5 years. So she's 6 months sober. I was that teenage runaway kid. So I was like the kid who ran away from home. And my real story starts with, I started going into treatment at 15 years old. I'm grateful for that. I wasn't grateful then, but I'm grateful today because that's how I got a high school diploma. I probably wouldn't have one if I didn't do that. And so addiction has been very heavy in my life for a long time.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Because you said that in the beginning too, that addiction was always prevalent in your family. Back then, did you call it addiction, or is that just what our family does? Does that make sense? I mean, were you guys cognizant of the fact that this isn't normal and this is probably addictive behavior, or was it, this is just what we do?
I think I was still kind of young and it was scary, but I think it was just what we did. I mean, my dad, our kind of story goes with when my dad decided to get sober or clean. He was a blackout drinker and did a whole bunch of stuff, and he found us all hiding in a closet, and he thought he had killed us. And when he came to, he had no idea what happened to his family from his night before. So it was that was typical for our family. Like we hid from my dad, and hiding.
That's a sad statement when you say that was typical. Yeah. Because that shouldn't be typical for anybody. And no. I can't imagine what it's like being a young girl hiding in a closet and having your dad find you guys in there and be happy that he didn't kill you. Yeah. I mean, that's crazy.
I have chills, but that was the reality of my home. And so my mom hiding as years got better. I mean, as you know, and as we all know, it's way more than just stopping using. I mean, there was years of trauma and pain that had to get better. And I think I'm finally at this point in my life where I'm able to have a good relationship with my dad. But even 1.5 years ago, we didn't speak to each other much just because the pain I put him through and my hatred from my childhood, and my resentments.
So 35 years ago, you were checked into your first rehab. Now, did you go willingly or was this ordered?
Oh, I ran away from home. finally, my parents had finally found me and they tricked me. You know, I was very upset. They told me they said, look, we just want to take you out to lunch. And I was like, okay, well, I'm 15. And let me tell you this, you know, it's a scary world out there. And these teenage runaways, which I experienced, and this is a big part of my story, you know, the things that happen on the streets, because I didn't go live in somebody's home. You know, I just went and drugged and partied around and went around there. And the things that happened to adults who are homeless happened to me as a 15-year-old. You know, so I learned a really dark, ugly world, you know. So when my parents were like, I felt like I couldn't go home because how was I going to tell them the trauma that happened to me and these horrible things? Like it was ugly. And so when they said, let's go have dinner, I was like, oh, good. It's been 10 days. You know, I want to go have dinner, you know, go get a good lunch. Because at that point, a good lunch in a restaurant, not this shuffle I was doing, sounded good. But my lunch was in a rehab and I was really angry. I was very, very upset because they took my freedom away. And I didn't have a problem, of course. I was 15 and I knew everything and I knew better. And of course, that was the life.
How long were you away from home on the streets, so to speak?
This particular round was 10 full days. I mean, and this was back when there weren't cell phones, you know, so caller ID had just came out. And I mean, nobody really had it then. This is like 1995, I think about. And so my dad had gotten a caller ID, you know, if you guys remember that back in the day, those boxes. And so I would call just to talk to my mom, because at that point I thought my dad was the tyrant. You know, he was a powerhouse and he was really controlling and he was still, you know, sick in his own ways. And so I thought it was, you know, calling my mom was the right thing, but they ended up being able to kind of start to track me down. But we were in Conwood Heights and I'm like hanging out in Clearfield, and I wanted to hang out with the Job Corps guys because those were the guys that were going to take me somewhere. I mean, that's what I thought as a smart 15-year-old. But it was dark.
So after your first stint in rehab, did you stay sober for a while, or were you back right at it?
I was back. So I went in, my 15th birthday I spent in rehab, and I went 3 more times since then. And each time I had gone was a 3 to 5 month period. So my parents, thank God for them, you know, had the experience of my sister who was just not okay. So they wanted to nip it in the butt with me. And I was defiant. I didn't think there was anything wrong. I wanted, like people, like adults, I wanted to keep my friends, and my friends were my real friends. And so I was back and forth. I did learn a lot, and I'm grateful for it today. But then I was really angry.
You make some good points that, you know, the adolescent brain is a brain that is still very egocentric. You're thinking only about things from your own point of view. And so adolescents are at high risk for those sorts of high risk behaviors, running away, trying drugs, you know, other dangerous behaviors, because they feel A, sort of invincible, and B, that they know better, or that the people they're with are their true best friends and will take care of them, that sort of thing. And so, you know, when kids run away from home, adolescents run away from home, they're at tremendously high risk for drugs and addiction and abuse.
Yeah. Well, and that's what happened. You know, I went and hung out and thought I was in this safe place with a bunch of guys. And those guys, I understood then why people say men are scary. You know, I was taken advantage of by multiple men, and I was young, and it was like, but that's what happens. You know, that's what happens with, not with all, but a typical party scene is, especially with young kids, I had no business being there. And those men definitely had no business to do what they did to me. But I thought that was the cool thing to do, to go get drunk and hang out with these people. And they instantly saw I was inebriated and went and had at it. But I think that's kind of typical for young people who run away.
Now, Rachael, so you get out of rehab the first time after 4 or 5 months being 15. How long do you stay sober before you go back into another one?
Oh, I went right back. Like, I would graduate, and and I would go right back to my friends. And a big part of my story is this group of friends that it's kind of interesting how I would go right back to those friends and I would start doing the same thing. I would stay smoking. We would start to drink a little bit, smoke a little pot. And it always, the cycle kept going. And then it just kept going. So I moved my last time I had graduated class program. I graduated high school. I got to walk down the aisle. It was really cool. And we moved to California because I knew my dad had just moved out there and he was working and he said I could come work with him. And so for me, run away again, so I left those friends and I went and worked in the movie industry. I did craft services and I was, and so for the first 5 years of my adult life, I made a lot of money. And like $80,000, $100,000 a year for a kid in Hollywood. Like, if you could only imagine what that did, because I just learned how to party harder and with more money. Long story short, I go back to New York to be after 9/11, we go back to New York. I want to be a hairdresser to go back to the movie industry. And then, of course, typical story again. I met a guy, got married, had kids. I never went back to Hollywood to be a hairdresser, but we eventually ended up back in Utah, and I went out to a bar and I ran into these same friends who I would always get in trouble with then, who at this point, they are just professionals in their careers. I mean, these guys were real pimps. Like, I'm not like real pimps, real gangsters, real drug dealers, always at the strip club. And so I went to go hang out with them. And within 3 months, I was ready to leave my family. And that's where my real horrible, sad story of addiction kind of comes to play. Like, I was always addicted, and in New York I was homeless with the backpack, and addiction always played its part. But there's something about addiction in Utah, and I call it Tweakerland, because that's where I tried opiates, and thank God for me, like, God didn't want me to be an opiate addict, because in my early 20s, I ate them. Everybody was eating Vicodins. I just didn't like them. I just got sick, and it wasn't for me. Like, I loved speed, and I loved cocaine and crack, like things that my sick goal was I want to be up for 12 days. Like, let's get 12 day 12. So I come back here. I see these guys. I'm ready to completely give up my family, and I do. I divorced my husband that I'd been with we'd been married. It was our 10th year anniversary. I decided I don't want to be him. I don't want to be with him. I left my kids. I became that mom who I would go out for a night. I didn't come home for weeks. And I ended up my family hated me. Everybody hated me. I mean, everybody in my family hated me. My kids were 7 and 8 at the time. So I don't think they understood. They did, but they didn't. But I did the same. Instead of being at home, treating them like how I grew up, I just disappeared. And I thought, as long as my kids aren't seeing me be that person, that I'm not a bad person. Like, the reality and the insanity was, be home with your children. My thought was, as long as they don't see me high on a 5-day bender, everything will be fine. But I didn't come home. I mean, I would go. I remember one sad story is Christmas Eve came, and I had this great idea. We'll go return Christmas gifts, or return stuff so I could provide Christmas for my kids. And then I missed Christmas. I didn't come home for 3 days. And it wasn't on purpose. I thought I was going to get there. And that was the mother and the person I became. And I ended up not being welcome here. They didn't want me around, and I get it. When I came home, I was withdrawing off of a 5 or 6 day bender, and I just slept for 24 or 48 hours. And it was ugly. And the end of my story is just not typical for me, was homeless, nowhere to go, waking up on the side of the street with somebody stolen my shoes, type of story.
So that actually happened, where you were sleeping on the street and someone stole your shoes?
Yeah, I did. It was the craziest thing. It was the craziest thing. I'm like, who takes somebody's dollar flip-flops? But they did.
Somebody who doesn't have flip-flops.
Huh?
Somebody who doesn't have flip-flops.
Well, yeah, but it was like, so you hear that often, but I would trip out, and I was like, dude, and be at my feet, and like, why am I walking around with no shoes on? I was nuts.
So often on this podcast, we hear about someone's rock bottom. Although it sounds like you walked around on the bottom for a while, what eventually became your rock bottom?
Well, for me, I had multiple rock bottoms. Like, I had experiences where you would think, like, why are you still using it? Like, I had an experience that these friends thought that I was working with the cops. So they literally kidnapped me, beat the crap out of me in a car for an hour and a half, like just beat. And you would think at that point, literally, like, they're talking about go throw me with weights down in the Great Salt Lake, or like just crazy stuff. They throw me out on this basically side of the road for dead. And you would think at that point I would say, I got to get something better. But what my sick addict brain said is, dude, I got to get really high in order to be able to get through this. I mean, my face was not my face. Just multiple things like that always happening. And for me, the end of my story was I was tired. It was summer, and I had come to my mom's house I wanted to see my kids. I really wanted to shower. I'd been in the same clothes probably for a week. I was gross. I'm 5'6", so 127 pounds is really skinny for me. But that's where I was. My face was gray and sunken in, and I'd come to take a shower and get a good meal. And the first thing I told my mom was, and my mom's super LDS, okay? So like no cursing. She's always told me my whole life, if you go to jail, I'm not answering any phone calls, and I frequented jail. So I come to her house, and I'm with my bags, right? My homeless people bags. And I say, look, it's the weekend. And I thought this was normal. I'm like, there's probably going to be some cops that come here looking for me because there's a bunch of warrants out there. But if they do, just don't answer the door. Like, that's normal to say to somebody. And that's what ended up happening. I slept on the couch for 2 days. My mom had pictures of, at the time I was mad, but as I go through my recovery, I post these often now, but it was me passed out for days on the couch. My kids were young. They were sitting on top of me, so happy that I was there. The both of them sitting on top of me, playing with their toys. So I'm like, literally just like that for 2 or 3 days. So I hear the doorbell ring. And my little girl, my youngest, I think she was 8 at the time, was so happy. I could hear her say, Mommy, my mommy's here. And so I look up to see who it is, and she lets the warrant squad come in. There's 5 cops that come in, and all I'm thinking is, can't run now. And for whatever reason, that broke me. The cops were really cool. They didn't handcuff me in front of the kids. They took me outside and around the corner, and then we went to the jail. But them seeing their mom go away was enough for me to say, like, dude, you got to get your stuff together, because they are seeing it and they are realizing what's happening. And from then forward, I have 3 years and some change now, and I've never looked back, and I've done some really great things. And my kids love me, and I don't think that they hate me, or we have a really good, strong relationship for what I've done to them.
Now, the question I have for you is, a lot of times when we're talking about addiction, people are numbing pain from the past or looking for something different. Did you ever figure out why you were running or where you were going?
Like I kind of said before, my family was super dysfunctional. There was a lot of hurt and a lot of pain. I mean, there was no hugging that happened in my family. My mom was abused her whole life. And so affection was never there. And then trauma that started to set in. And when I moved remind you, I'm from Queens, New York. Okay. So when I moved to Utah in the 5th grade, I was like Fran Drescher, New Yorker. So it was like, I got to get a coffee, a quarter, my dollar. Where I talk like that. And so everybody teased me. So every day in school, the teacher would say, hey, Rachel, we want you to talk out loud. And then everybody laughed at me. And so I didn't know at that point that people just really liked how I spoke, what I heard as a young kid was, and I came in New York clothes. Like, we were way ahead of the time. I was in all neon green and really big glasses and Jersey hair, you know. So they just laughed at me. And so I went from being this popular kid from the neighborhood to this weird person that everybody laughed at. And so I found a crowd of people who accepted me, which were misfits. They didn't laugh at me. They didn't treat me horribly. I mean, we understood each other. So, I mean, mine was a lot of teenage torment that I was running from because I thought there was something wrong with me.
Dr. Matt?
That's such an important time in life, and feeling accepted by peers is part of how we develop our, sense of identity of who we are as people. And so, yeah, that you're in that pre-adolescent 5th, 6th grade time, and then through junior high school and high school, those are really important years. And it's so common that the misfits type groups of kids are very accepting. They always have been, and very nice and kind and accepting. And unfortunately, that one of the things that can be happening in those groups, besides acceptance, is also substance abuse and getting high. A lot of the kids are together in those kind of misfit groups because they have trauma in their background and they're supporting each other, but they're, you're young enough that you don't have healthy, mature ways to do that. So, drugs and alcohol are a very common part of that mix, but it's enticing when you feel on the outside to be accepted, especially at those ages. And adults who don't understand that are forgetting what it's like to try to find a sense of who you are when you're 12, 13, 14, and it's powerful.
Oh, it was brutal.
What pops into my mind is that old saying, misery loves company. And, sometimes that's what we do, is we attract people the way we are feeling. That's why I think optimism is such a great personality trait, because you're going to attract like-minded people. And so if you feel like you're broken, if you feel, you suffer from trauma, then yeah, you're going to search out people who do commiserate or understand kind of what you're going through. But that's just the way I see it. I don't know about you, Dr. Matt.
Yeah, definitely. I think as a developmental psychologist, you have to, I think often in terms of where is a person at in their personal development. And so adolescents, especially early adolescents, they have a strong need to be accepted by others. And miserable people, if you want to say it that way, misery loves company. It's like you're trying to make yourself feel a little bit better by connecting. And we've talked a lot on this show. In fact, it's kind of our theme is that the opposite of addiction is connection. Connecting, human beings connecting, is one of the most powerful drives we have as humans. Look at everything we do, like what we're doing today is a way of connecting, right? And especially during those early years. So yeah, absolutely, you want to connect, especially when you're feeling on the outside and moving from one very different culture to another culture here in Utah.
Oh, dude, it was a culture shock.
Yeah, very, very different. And that's, that would have been traumatizing in and of itself, even if your family had been very functional and supportive. So, yeah,
Rachael,
you were kind of behind the 8 ball from the beginning moving to Utah.
Yeah.
Rachael, let me ask you this. So you're sleeping on your mom's couch for 2 days. Your kids are playing toys on top of you as you sleep off a 5-day bender. The door rings, the cops come in. They're cool by your standards and say they put handcuffs on you around the house. And that's when you say you started to make a change. What did that change look like for you? Did you end up going to your 3rd rehab at that point, or how did you get sober?
So it was probably really like a 9-month bender. I'm not even kidding you. I hadn't been home probably in 9 months at that point, but I went, you hear a lot of people say that you can't recover, because I had tried since 2015. I had gotten some pretty crazy DUIs. From 2015 forward, I tried to get better. And so I would get like 6 months here and 10 months here, but I cheated. Like, I would either drink or I'd be taking Adderall, because if I'm not doing meth and I'm doing Adderall, what's it's legal. So I never really worked the real program. I'd done programming. I went to I did a residential. I did a lot of outpatient. But I did it for probation, which you probably hear a lot of people say, so the treatment didn't matter to me because I just didn't want to be on paper. But this time, and I was still on paper, I went into the jail and I realized I needed to really pray and do something different. And that's where I really had a spiritual awakening. I got into the Bible. Usually I have it right here, but I didn't leave my cell that time. I got I read the Bible. That's the only thing I did. And when I got out, I realized the only way I was going to do and I hid in my house for a year. I got a job that I worked from home at. The only time I went to the store went out was either if my kids missed the bus and I don't recommend this for everybody, but if you have to do it this way, I knew I didn't trust myself. So I either went to the grocery store with my mom or taking my kids to school. Eventually I realized I had to do something different. And then I started getting into, at about 5 months, I got really into online recovery and started sharing my story and in a bunch of different groups and some really popular ones. I don't know if they're around today, but got into it like that. And I finally realized, I have all the tools to get better. I knew that everything had to change. So you hear people say, if you want to change and get better, you have to change everything. So I got rid of all of the friends that I always held on to because I thought I could go, hang out with people shooting up meth and smoking bath salt and not do it, but that never worked. You know what I mean? So this round, I got rid of everybody, all the people, places, and things. I started to I realized I would like to help people. So I was helping people throughout the country get into rehab. And then I realized, why am I doing it for people I'll never ever meet when we have such a huge need here in Salt Lake County in general? And that's kind of how the woman I am today came to be. So, I mean, I was definitely over-programmed. Going to another rehab at that point was just, for me, a waste of time because I had the tools. I had the tools that I'd learned starting from 15 all the way up to 30. I guess it was, if I'm 40, so it's 36.
So you started implementing. Dr. Matt, what it sounds like is she found a community and you found a purpose, and your purpose was service. And it seems like so many people in the recovery world try to find that purpose, and service is such a great way to be involved and help out others. But I think the community is really what you latched onto, which brings me to what you're doing now. And I met you through Addicted We Stand, but now you're doing your own, which is Beyond Addiction Mosaic. What is that?
So Beyond Addiction Mosaic is we're a resource community, and you had touched on it before about how community and connection is so important. So we wanted to be a real resource to everybody that's affected from addiction. So from the very beginning part of anybody who is looking for treatment and those resources, family members, the addict themselves, to the beyond addiction part of when you do get out of treatment or you get out of whatever, then what do you do? How do you get a job when you're a felon? How do you go to an interview? How do you explain these lapses and things? How do you get on housing? How do you, so that's kind of the beyond addiction part. We added the word mosaic into it. So if you know for those who don't know what mosaic is broken glass. That when you broken glass that's put together to create something beautiful or a beautiful piece of art. And that's what the recovery community is to me. It's a bunch of broken people who, when we find recovery, we come together to create something beautiful. And so that's kind of what our goal is. Like we help people get into treatment. We're very service oriented. I mean, COVID makes things complicated. We go out and we feed the homeless very often. We were going into senior centers and doing arts and craft nights and going into treatment centers and doing workshops. We kind of have to implement how we do things today, just because you can't go into a senior center nowadays. Sorry, my phone's ringing. But we're a resource center group.
So it sounds like you're doing wonderful things. I'm sure our listeners would want to know, how are your children now? And I guess your dad's living with you, so he's doing well too.
Yeah, everybody's great. My parents are, my dad's recovery is beautiful, and he's been able to really do well for himself. So he lives in a beautiful home. I live in a basement apartment. It's a 3-bedroom basement apartment in the basement. My kids they're great. They're happy. They do really good in school. I probably should put them in therapy, but they're not little. They're happy. They're happy. They have a lot of friends. They do A and B students.
Do you feel that, you talked about a lot of trauma, both developmental trauma from growing up in a dysfunctional home to being assaulted and having traumatic experiences as an adolescent. And have you found therapy has played any sort of role in your life?
I love therapy. So I appreciated the therapy I got as an adolescent, because I was open about it, because I was hurting and I had plenty of time in the treatment center to go through it. But then as an adult, from 2015 to 16, I did a lot of one-on-one therapy. And so I had my own personal therapist that I went to, plus my therapy. I didn't find treatment, honestly, to be anything exciting, because I never, my treatment experience was the therapist, because I knew how to talk the talk from my adolescence. They were always like, oh, you know what to do. We don't really have much work to do with you. So, I thought that was really interesting, because clearly, I was there with multiple charges and homeless.
Well, to be honest, not every therapist is amazing, just like not every dentist is very good at what they do. So,
yeah.
Unfortunately, some therapists kind of, need to up their game when they're working with teenagers, especially. But I bring it up only for the fact that I think a lot of people are sort of resistant to the idea. They're like, oh, I'm fine now. I'm sober now. But the reality is, I think one of the things that has been shown to prevent relapses in people's lives is, once you are sober and living, a sober life, to then go back and kind of work through traumas from your past, because trauma is a real trigger for relapse. And I think the people who only look at recovery as not using are at high risk to relapse. And one of the things that has to be repaired, I think, is our psyche, our emotional selves, not just getting off of a substance, but kind of developing that emotional part of who we are and psychological part of who we are.
Yeah.
Now, Rachael, I've got something, and I don't want to put you on blast, and I don't want to scare you, but we've got Dr. Matt here, and I think our listeners would like to know his thoughts and your thoughts on it. Whereas your dad was an addict, you were an addict, the likelihood that your kids could be addicts is pretty high, and you want to break that chain and stop that cycle. Are you concerned about that? And if so, what preparations are you taking?
I'm very concerned about it, and I'm not going to get too into this, but their dad's a normie, right? So their dad can go out and drink a glass of whiskey, and he'll just sip on it throughout the whole night and never finish it. So he tries to tell them, we had a fight just recently. He was like, why don't tell them not to go get drunk, because I say, college is partying and we have to keep you away from that. And he tells me, don't deny them that right to go out and have fun and get drunk. I'm just like, we get into the fight, and I'm like, you do realize what their genes are, and their gene is they're more than likely going to have a problem. And so I'm very open with them. We talk a lot about recovery. We talk about drinking. My nephew, who lives upstairs, he's got some addiction problems that are in the making. He hasn't progressed to hard drugs yet, but he smokes pot every once in a while. He's got the addiction. He can't stop vaping, so I'm open with them. I try to show them, and not fear, but I try to let them know, like, when we go out and do stuff, that they need to be careful. If I go out and I speak in a jail, I tell them these are the people, and I don't ever try to shame the addict, but I do try to teach them, this is where you'll end up if, you know, and I have functioning addict, you know, or alcoholic family members. So we talk about that too with them. But I think as they get older, they're 12 and 13 now, so they understand it a lot more.
But a lot of people who have come on this podcast started at that age.
Yeah, it's scary.
You know?
Well, I think you're doing the right thing by having the conversation with them, being able to have an open, honest conversation with your kids about drugs and alcohol, so that you know, if they do experiment with that as they get older, that they will be less likely to hide it from you. You know, eliminating the shame factor is super important to help our kids. I understand, you know, the kid's dad's point of view, sort of, but the reality is that, you know, your kids are at a much higher risk. If you look at the research, you know, does it mean for sure they'll become addicts? No, of course not. But we have to look at our family histories, and that's important, whether it's your cardiovascular health or cancer you know, they're at much, much higher risk. So I think you're doing what you can do, which is A, set a really good example for them, and B, in conversation, just talk about it once, but it should be an ocean throughout their adolescence and young adult life, so that they know where you stand, but that they feel like they can always talk with you. So that's about what you can do as a parent.
Yeah.
Rachael, I want to say thank you very much for stopping by the podcast today. If people want to find out more about Beyond Addiction Mosaic, it's a Facebook page, but where else can they get information if they need it?
Right. I mean, they can reach out to me directly. We're pretty much at this point are just on Facebook. We're our website, beyondaddictionmosaic.org. They can come on to too. That'll be active in a week. It's just we're fixing some things that were on there. We're pretty much social media based due to COVID at this point. We have an office, but we're not bringing people in there right now.
Let me ask you this. How does somebody fund something like this?
We're just based off of donations. Everything we do at this point is all off donations and people who see what we've built a good reputation. I mean, people have been seeing me in the community over the last 2 years and all the work that I do. So we've been blessed to have a lot of people trust me, if that makes sense. You know, there's a lot of nonprofits out there, but people see when they donate, it goes to exactly what the cause was for. And we're very active in the community. I mean, we're out constantly out there doing something all the time. But if you mean like if somebody wanted to donate, we have a donate button on our page. People send us checks.
And I follow you guys on Facebook, and you do a lot of great things with creating a community, people who are finding that connection that Casey and I talk about so much through your Facebook group, talking about their recovery being 24 hours clean or, 24 months clean. I mean, and posting a lot of, I think, supportive and inspirational things. So you're doing good work on Facebook.
Thank you.
The last thing I want to mention is that I too follow you on Facebook. That's where I get all my information. Is that recently there was a lady in recovery in Washington who was just elected to which position?
The lady in Washington. She just got it, and was it governor?
I think it was, or something like that.
But she was a felon. So I was like, that's awesome. And she's only in recovery for 5 years.
And you were thinking maybe that'd be something for you. And that's what I really love about recovery, is to see people come out on the other side and not only break down barriers, jump over fences, break ceilings, is to let them know that, hey, just because we had a problem doesn't mean we are a problem, and we can be whatever we want. It's up to us.
Yeah. Well, and that's where this election has taught me so much. And, knowing that I could one day be in a political field of some nature, like I have this goal that I will be in Washington in 2023. I don't know what I'm going to be doing yet, but I will be there making a difference. I know I can, and that recovery brought that to me.
And you're making a difference now. So thank you for stopping by. This is Project Recovery, a podcast about addiction, more importantly about recovery. It's brought to you by our friends at useonlyasdirected.org. They got a new program out. It's Know Your Script when talking to the doctor, when talking to family, when talking to loved ones. Don't forget, Project Recovery is a KSL podcast.
The contents of this program are for informational purposes only. The program is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, licensed therapist, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you've heard on this program. KSL does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, physicians, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned on the program. Reliance on any information provided on the program is solely at your own risk.
2 years ago, Americans watched in horror as a crisis unfolded at the Kabul airport.
She was tear-gassed and beaten.
Images of thousands desperate to escape Taliban oppression filled our news feeds. More than 80,000 Afghans made it to America, but the story didn't end there.
It was very cold, there was no power, no heat.
Who would help our newest neighbors? I'm Andrea Smartin. In Stranger Becomes Neighbor, you'll hear the stories of some remarkable refugees who left their homes and their dreams behind, only to start over from zero.
Their only possession was 3 blankets.
And you'll meet Americans who stepped up to help them.
You want me to come when you deliver your baby.
What can one person do in the face of an international disaster decades in the making? That's Stranger Becomes Neighbor. Find us at kslpodcast.com, follow us on Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen.